read a story about a young man who had been through tragedy and suffering. He was expecting a child after the loss of an only son. The man had set his hopes for the future on a son and employed a fortune teller to confirm a determination of the baby's sex in a place and time without access to medical imaging that could give a more accurate expectation. Complications arose in the labor, and the mother and child were almost lost. Desperate measures were taken by the woman in the house to attempt to save first the baby, who was finally delivered safely, then the mother, who had lost and was still losing a concerning amount of blood. As the story continued, the grandmother who had attended to the birth finally came out of the room with the child who was healthy and shared the news of the near deaths of both, and that the mother, though was not bleeding now, was still in a place of precarious life. When the woman presented her son with his daughter, he refused to hold the child in fury and remarked, "Once again, God had failed them. What a wasted opportunity for God to get this right and make amends for the trauma the family had suffered. A girl? How could God have allowed this?" A few days later, in another book, I read about a man who had grown up in church with his family, where he was taught about a good God who loves us and promised to bring us blessings. The boy grew into a man who found a beautiful wife who also loved God. He used his education to land a good job, where he prospered and was always able to provide well for his growing family. His children followed a straight path, married well, and had healthy grandchildren. No one wanted for anything, and it seemed so perfect, just like it was supposed to be when you love God and God loves you. Until, unexpectedly, one of his sons developed a brain tumor that did not have the potential for treatment. And regardless of all the praying family and church friends, his adult son died a death that included great suffering toward the end. This tragedy tore open the threads of the family, and one of the man's granddaughters began struggling in school and turning to addiction. The perfect picture was now broken, and the man told his wife he simply could not believe in a good God anymore. What had they done to deserve these painful circumstances? However, since he couldn't believe in a God that wasn't good, he decided there was no God at all. He claimed, "There is no purpose or meaning. Life is simply a game of chance, leaving some lucky and some unlucky." He deduced now he was one of the unlucky. From now on, he would fend for his family and himself on his own. Considering these two unconnected tales this morning, I headed out to walk the woods from my house on a single-track trail that rarely sees another person. The trail runs between my property and the neighboring farm and leads into the national forest eventually, wandering into West Virginia. I am pretty sure I could get halfway across that state before seeing another human being. I love these woods. I love watching my dogs wander up and down the sides of the gentle canyon as I walk along the little stream bed, and they sniff out squirrels and joyfully run through the woods, over rocks and under branches. This trail is a special place for me, and right now it is in the glory of early October. The light is warm, the leaves are beginning to change, but there's still enough green that I don't have to fear winter's stark imminence yet. We still have the rest of October and even November before winter can be taken seriously. The colors are more vibrantly gold than the dying reds and browns that will come, and the temperatures are crisp but not chilling, still promising gentle warmth in the afternoon. I rarely step onto this trail without my spirit falling into a deep gratitude and a sense of wonder that I can hardly believe this is my life. I spend a lot of time and thought on this trail, in prayer, contemplation, and quiet as I walk. This morning, in the golden light, I considered some of the trials my own life had seen. More than some, less than others. I have struggled and grieved. I've started over more than once, and this current life I woke up to today is not one I had scripted in any of the iterations of writing out my story I have done in the years past. Could I be the only one with this condition? Do we not all do this? Consciously or unconsciously, we plan out our lives in the way that seems fitting to us. Isn't that what most of us in the West consider ultimate freedom? The right to script our lives in the way we think they should go? I considered these stories. The men had a plan in mind, and when reality took them off script, each found themselves unmoored, somehow off plot, and they became certain they'd either been failed by God or that there must be no God, only blind chance or fate. I can understand a sense of confusion, yet in both stories, I found myself aghast at their conclusion. The first story was so clearly a tale of the goodness of God to give wisdom to the women in a home birth that saved a mother and child whose lives were very seriously on the line. One mother's view of the day is clearly the miraculous love of a Father God, brought life against the schemes of death. Yet an earthly father could only see his plan of another son to replace a lost child had been derailed. Someone from outside the plot entirely might even notice what a grace on this child and family this was, considering no child can live up to being a replacement for a lost sibling. The entire scene was dripping with God's love. Can we be so stuck on our plot that we cannot see the grace and love poured out on us? Could God denying us our imagined story actually be a kindness? In the second story, I could see as it unfolded that someone with such a shallow experience of how God loves his children might be in for stormy seas when finally something doesn't go according to their perfect, comfortable plan. Yet I was still dumbfounded to think that decades of blessing and comfort and ease could be in any way seen as poor luck because disease finally makes its way in and the trauma that enters with it arrives. The man was blinded to the generous blessings that surrounded him with one difficult situation that came. Can we also be so blind? I'm looking deeper this year into what it means that God is love. I'm asking questions about the sovereignty of God. What does that mean? Asking questions about my perception of things and how it's not always what is true in the larger and longer view. For example, I might hope to ride my horse on the only day I have free in a week and find the day it rained significantly. I have some options on how to respond. I could ride anyway and brave poor weather conditions. Maybe this will make me stronger in some way, taking on adverse conditions. I could choose to curse the rain and wonder why God would do this to me. Did he not know I had plans to ride my horse today? My horse also needs exercise. Could God have not answered my prayer for a good riding day on the only day I had available? Does he not love me? What if he did know and sent the rain as a gift from a good father? What if I needed rest in a busy season and my only day to ride my horse was also the only day I had to rest and recover? What if, without a day of rest, vulnerability to sickness was at my doorstep? Meanwhile, the rain is needed for grass my horses need to eat as the pastures recover from a partial drought and the springs are getting perilously dry. What if the rain being held back on the busy days helped make my chores and work go more smoothly in order to get through all I had to do? And this day the rain pressed me into postponing my original plans and staying in, reading a book, or taking a needed nap. Is the rain an expression of love or is it inconvenient? Does God really consider every single detail? Does he bring the rain or the unfortunate circumstances? Or does he simply allow them and promise to weave them together for my good and his glory? What does that even mean? Might I begin to live in a way that whatever comes, instead of fighting it, I ask God how to see it, how to use what I've been given, or really trust that it's for my good? A day of rain might feel like an inconvenience. Maybe I can get to the spiritual resilience that I can handle a disappointing rainy day. But what about a scary diagnosis, or a tragic accident, or even a premeditated violent attack that shifts a life forever? A natural disaster that claims more lives than we can count? Is God in these things? Does he allow, or does he send them? With these questions come even larger, for me, the wish to understand, well, how then do I pray? How many times do I pray against the difficulty God is sending me for some great purpose out of his love? Yet, I don't believe it is ever wrong to pray for healing, or even to pray for smoothing out of challenging circumstances. Is there a way we might pray, however, that would align us more closely with the Father's heart? When God sent an illness to David's son with Bathsheba, see 2 Samuel chapter 12, he fasted and prayed for the son to be healed. When God answered clearly with the death of the child, those around David worried he would finally become unhinged. But he did not. When the child died, he cleaned himself up and he ate. He accepted the answer from God and took the steps to continue forward in this new plot, one he had not written himself. Considering until this point, the plot David had been writing was bordering on incredibly evil, it's a great kindness that God intervened through Samuel, through David's heart, and in the end, taking the child born of such selfish sin and shifted the plot. Even this shifting plot was not suffering and pain-free for David, but God kept his promise to always be with him as he walked in the greatness of being the king, as well as the humility of being on the run again due to consequences of his poor choices. David's example reminds me it is always good to pray for health and healing and victory, even if it is God who sent the illness, and to trust when God gives us plot twists we had hoped against. And in time, we'll get on the same page. In this, it would be better for me to accept that regardless of if I like the chapter at the moment, God does love me. He is a good God, and he promises to weave a beautiful and perfect story for my life here as I stay in submission to his larger story. I once heard of an airplane example where an airplane was flying through smooth skies with attendants serving food and drink when a sudden loss of altitude sent everyone not secured off balance, luggage tumbling, and a few minor injuries from the violent shift. Later, after the grumbling of the discomfort, cuts, scrapes, and bruises, it was learned that somehow a mistake had been made and there was an imminent collision with another aircraft. The only way to save all the lives on the two planes was to make a radical correction to a different altitude all at once. The same inconvenience was then seen completely differently. It had to do with perspective, but also of understanding of things greater than what is in front of us at the moment. Ideally, there would never be that kind of error that made that situation in the first place. But this is akin to expecting heaven's circumstances present here on earth. Humans dumped that script early on in the fall. Apparently, the perfect story seemed dull to Eve, and our ancestors preferred to write their own. Isn't that what the tree of knowledge of good and evil provided? The right to write your own destiny, your own story, your own script? You too can be like God. Only we are not qualified for that role. Ironically, Satan doesn't actually need to take over. He just needs to get enough imperfect, self-centered humans to decide we should take over. Even if it's only take over our own lives, that does enough damage that he doesn't have to do much else to bring in great destruction. When my life has gone off script in the past, I have at times embraced it and ran toward the exciting adventure change brings. But in other times, I have grieved and mourned from the brokenness and uncertainty ahead of me. Youth, I think, is helpful in bringing a kind of hope that even if we don't have our story on track, we have time to drag it back and drag as many others along to make it work out how we think it should. The longer we live and don't see the plot coming back to our original hopeful plan, things can start to shake underneath us. Possibly more difficult is when it seemed to be going so well when some violent shift jerks us onto an entirely new story that we had not considered. Today, I read that God's love language is trust. He promises that he is good and he loves us. So when the plane changes altitude abruptly and sends us to the ground with bruises, cuts, and scrapes, do we trust that this was an act of love and kindness, or do we grumble about the cuts and bruises? What about when the plane crashes into the ocean and we're floating on debris wondering if we'll be rescued? There was a season when I asked God to please stop helping. I had asked him to come and take over in my life because it was apparent I was steering dangerously close to the cliffs, and the darker things got, the less I could see where I was going. I knew I was in peril. Looking back, what it felt like is God agreed to help, and then he drove us over the cliff into the ocean on purpose. God, are you mad? Is this your idea of helping? Thankfully, it was a convertible, and we flew into the air, lived through the crash into the dark water below, and somehow find a life vest. Can we say grace? I might have been okay, but then we end up almost drowning in the rapids on our way to safety. Still no one to pull me out of the water. And at some point, I'd had about enough of God's course correction and figured if he didn't stop helping me get back onto dry land, I would not live through it all. He didn't listen because apparently my original plea for help was binding. Thankfully, he believed more in me than I did in myself. He kept going, pulling me along, and somehow I got stronger. I got less shaken by the detours, rapids, and altitude shifts. Eventually, I began to see we were getting into better terrain, and I started to learn to trust. God could have simply translated us from the cliffs of despair onto the straight path through the wilderness, but he didn't. We went through it all instead, together. As I walk my wooded trail, I considered the things I'm hoping for that I can't see evidence of yet. On the other hand, I also considered the ridiculous favor and blessing I can see weaving around me undeserved. I can see the soft light through the rhododendron tunnel. It's like stained glass on the ground with golden leaves creating this yellow gold walkway. I consider the trail I love walking with my dogs, and I know it's unlikely I will walk this trail forever. Someday it'll just be a beautiful memory as my story takes more unexpected turns. This gift is a treasure, and I am thankful for it every time I set foot on it. I do not take it for granted. And yet 15 years ago, I could not imagine it. I spend less time today trying to write the story ahead of me because I have come to see that my wisdom runs quickly short-sighted and I don't have the same perfect view my father has. Over the years, I am more quick to go from panic to trust. The true, the real, the living God is more wild than I can comprehend. I want to know him as he is, not the him I think I imagine him to be. And yet I have to live in the tension that he wants me to know him, but his ways are so much higher than mine. I can't even imagine what things he has planned for those who love and serve him. This year, in my year of the wild, I have asked God to reveal more of himself to me and that I desire to know him and love him for who he is. This journey both excites and terrifies me. We may make our plans, but God arranges our steps. This is both comforting and frightening. What wonderful and terrible things has he planned for my life? I do want to find out, and I do want to trust him that even when disappointments come, I can be at peace, knowing nothing escapes him, and regardless of what evil might have been planned against me, I always win. God always spins the circumstances for my good, even if it feels like a dramatic course correction and I get a little bruised up along the way. When I see people around me who are unshakable and stand resilient in the face of anything, the common factor is to say that they are not so worried about their own plans. They seem to be able to shift more quickly into asking God what he's doing and how do they join him than they are to fight against what they see in front of them. I think this is tricky, especially when it looks like what we are doing was obviously God's plan, and it seems so obvious to us that God needs us to get in there and fight for his plan because it's apparently being thwarted. But is God so easily thwarted? Does he really need our help? Or does he honor us with the invitation to join him? Is it possible that that amazing mission trip that we had been planning gets derailed? We could sit back and ask God how to see what he is doing instead of raging against the world and the devil for daring to stop God's will. Could this detour actually be the plan A? And do we even ask it? Maybe this is how we someday come to count it all joy when we face trials and challenges. Maybe this is a way to see the rainy day, or the great program to share Jesus diverted, or the unexpected tragedy, being honest with the sadness, grief, and loss, but not to come unglued and begin fighting or self-protecting. Maybe as we continue to live our days here on earth, we can be at peace because we know whatever this plot twist is, it is being woven into a beautiful story that someday we will be astounded by. We will see that it wasn't that moment that mattered most, or even this chapter in our lives that in heartache can feel forever, but that all of these things were part of a bigger chapter in a bigger book in a much bigger story, that our part had great meaning. Maybe we will see that how we stewarded challenges, difficulty, and loss carried greater impact on generations than if the great plans went off without a hitch. Will we see that our part fit into something grand and stunning? Maybe we will see that nothing was lost in it all. The compassion we showed towards someone who hurt us terribly could shift a line that, though small at the time, ended up moving unseen mountains. Or maybe we will see moments we didn't understand while in them as a great kindness to us, a tender compassion from our Father that at the time didn't feel very good at all. Some of my deepest griefs and losses have over time shown themselves already as gifts I didn't know I desperately needed. I am only able to walk this trail in the woods today because of some unexpected plot twists I did not welcome at the time. Each day, I hold my future story more loosely and tell God the desires of my heart, and then ask Him to sift them for me, only granting me the ones that will build my bigger story and take His time in the ones that are not for now, even though I'm often impatient. Whatever I do not have right now, I do not need right now, and what is coming, I will be equipped to walk through in the time I'm called to do it. On my trail, I have more questions than answers most of the time, and this year has lent itself to a challenge in my writing because many of the pieces I begin to tease open disintegrate into great wonder and mystery, refusing to be tied back up into a neat blog post. But as I write this one, I have a hope it will find its way to being published, even if it leaves more questions than usual or doesn't have a tidy thread of a theme to follow and close with. Maybe this blog is more of a choose-your-own-adventure story from my childhood than a clear plot novel of adult. Maybe.